Napoleon Bonaparte, military genius, emperor, and the guy who literally redefined short king energy. For years, he was unstoppable, conquering Europe like it was his personal chessboard. But then came Waterloo, and it all came crashing down. So what went wrong?
Welcome to Shoulda, Coulda, Woulda, where we talk about what should have, could have, and would have been done to avoid the catastrophe we're about to see.
Today we're looking at how Napoleon could have avoided his infamous defeat at Waterloo. Spoiler, it involves checking the weather forecast, but we'll get to that later. Let's dive in. First off, let's talk about Napoleon's Achilles heel, overconfidence. By 1815, he was back from exile on Elba and ready to reclaim his empire. But here's the thing. He was facing a coalition of Britain, Prussia, and other European powers, which normally isn't fun. Napoleon thought he could split their forces and defeat them piecemeal. Bold, yes. Realistic, not so much. Historians agree. Napoleon underestimated his enemies. If he'd taken a more cautious approach, maybe fortified his position and waited for reinforcements, he might have had a better shot. Now, let's talk about the weather. Waterloo was fought on a rainy day, and that rain turned the battlefield into a muddy mess. Napoleon thought it'd be wise to delay his attack and let the ground dry, which gave his enemies precious time to regroup. Here's a pro tip. Napoleon could have attacked earlier, before the Prussians even had a chance to join the fight. Sure, the mud made it harder to move his artillery, but waiting only made things worse. Lesson 1. Sometimes you just have to roll with the weather, or at least bring better boots. Next up, the Allies. Napoleon was up against two of Europe's finest commanders, the Duke of Wellington leading the British and General Blücher commanding the Prussians. Napoleon's plan was to divide and conquer, but Wellington and Blücher had other ideas. Despite being from different nations, these two worked together like a well-oiled war machine. When Napoleon sent Marshal Grouchy to chase the Prussians, Grouchy failed to stop them from regrouping with Wellington. Lesson 2. If you're going to split your forces, make sure the guy you send knows what he's doing. And maybe double-check that your enemies aren't better at teamwork than you are. Timing is everything in war, and Napoleon's timing at Waterloo was, well, not great. By delaying his attack to let the ground dry, he gave Wellington precious time to strengthen his defensive positions. And Wellington's army was really good at playing defense. Also, the famous ridge at Mont Saint-Jean gave Wellington a natural advantage, and his troops were well trained in holding their ground. If Napoleon had attacked earlier, or avoided this particular battlefield altogether, he might have caught the Allies off guard, but instead, he gave them the upper hand. Lesson 3. Don't let your enemies set the stage. By late afternoon, things were looking grim for Napoleon. The Prussians had arrived. No! Prussians! And that tipped the balance in favor of the Allies. Desperate to turn the tide, Napoleon sent in his elite Imperial Guard, the most feared soldiers in Europe, but also his last card to play. But even the Guard couldn't save the day. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and eventually overwhelmed. When the Guard broke, so did Napoleon's army. It was game over. Could Napoleon have kept them in reserve or used them earlier in the battle? Maybe. But by the time they charged, it was already too late. So, why did Napoleon lose at Waterloo? Historians point to a combination of factors. Overconfidence, poor timing, underestimating his enemies, and the sheer strength of the coalition against him. But let's not forget the broader context. Napoleon was fighting against nearly all of Europe, and even his genius had its limits. Could he have won? Possibly. A faster attack, better coordination, or a more cautious strategy might have turned the tide. But even if he'd won at Waterloo, the coalition was determined to stop him. His enemies would have regrouped and come back stronger. Waterloo wasn't just a battle. It was the end of an era. Napoleon's defeat marked the fall of one of history's greatest military leaders. Could he have avoided it? Sure, by staying cautious, trusting his generals, and maybe not underestimating the weather. But hindsight's 20/20, right? Napoleon's ambition and brilliance brought him to the top, but also led to his downfall. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment about which historical disaster we should regret together next. Adios.